Okay, next week we will be getting back to Titus. And Warren's been out the assignment already, I think beginning of this week, maybe Monday, Sunday or Monday. We're going to be finishing a long section of Titus. If you want a printed copy, I have one here, I think maybe two, but otherwise it should be on the email. But today we're going to take a break and we're going to do part 2 of talking about PCA form of church government. So I was glad to see that Pastor Cushman came in because he knows this stuff a lot better than I do. So he'll be able to correct all the mistakes that I make. Well, let me start with this. A few weeks ago, I guess about a month ago, we started this. We did the part 1 on PCA church government. And we said that the church, the denomination is basically structured around 3 courts. So what are those courts? See how well you listened.
Session, Presbytery, and General Assembly.
Session, Presbytery, and General Assembly. That is correct. Very good. John, paying attention. Well, here's the interesting thing about the PCA. The lowest of those 3, which is the session, that's the most local, is actually the primary court. In other words, the courts above don't come and impose things on us. Things have to originate with the sessions. In other words, we're a bottom-up organization. And that was a reaction to the denomination that we came out of, which was a top-down organization, and where decisions were made at the top and then imposed on the local churches. And so when this denomination started in 1973, they decided to make it a bottom-up organization. And so the session of the church is the primary court and most important part, really. All right, so what I'm going to cover today is definitely not going to answer all your questions on the subject we're going to talk about. In fact, it'll probably raise more questions than it answers. And yet for some of you, it's like, let's just get this behind us and get back to Titus and understand that. But some of you are really interested in this, how the church works. And so I just wanted you to know that I'm available to sit down and talk with you either on the phone or in person and answer any of your questions, or at least attempt to answer any of the questions that I can. And so I just say that because I know that we're going to be too brief here. All right. So I asked last week for comments or suggestions of anybody had about things you would like to hear about. And I got one, and that one actually fits in with what I want to talk about. So I thought that's where we would start. And so the first thing I want to put up here on the screen, if this decides to work. What's the problem here, John? Let's try it this way. All right, that did. There we go. All right. So the qualifications for pastors of the Presbyterian Church in America. There's quite a few. The first is you need to get a seminary degree. Some of you may not be aware, but we have an official seminary for the PCA. It's called Covenant Seminary in St. Louis. There are many seminaries that feed into the pastoral staff of the PCA. Our own Birmingham Theological Seminary being one of them. That's where I graduated from. Westminster Reformed Seminary, which has branches all over the country, and a few others. And so you don't have to have gone to the official seminary or even any of those that I named. In fact, Mark Cushman went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Chicago area. Dave Matthews went to Dallas Theological Seminary. And so you can go to other seminaries and still come into the PCA. We'll talk about that in a moment, how that works. But the interesting thing is, over the last few years, Briarwood has actually stopped financially supporting our official seminary, Covenant, because it was felt, after some research was done, that some of the progressive emphasis that's coming into our denomination is originating at Covenant Seminary. So the official seminary we're not actually supporting, but we are supporting some of the others. So that's just by the way, but you might be interested to know that. Then there's a period of an internship, usually a year long, under an elder. And so you have someone that kind of mentors you and talks through different issues with you and works on different areas that you need to grow in, that sort of thing. Then you take the ordination exams. That's not a fun experience. There are 5 of them. There are 5 written exams that you take. You have one on the Book of Church Order. This is the Book of Church Order. It's not a thin document, and you get asked questions on that, and you're supposed to know how to answer all those questions. And then you have one on church history, one on general Bible knowledge, one on theology, and one on the sacraments. After taking those 5 exams, if you pass them all with a certain percentage, I'm not sure what it is exactly, then you get to have an oral exam before 6 or 7 elders, and they include the people who actually set up those exams. So they graded your test, and they know what questions you got wrong on your written exam, and they will almost for sure ask you about those questions in the oral exam to see if you went back and did any restudy to figure out what you obviously didn't know when you took the written exam. And so that's a fun experience, that oral exam. It can take any length of time. The smart thing to do is what I did, is to make sure you take the oral exam on a day where they have to do 5 or 6, and they hurry through it. You see, you don't want to be one of those guys that goes through and he's the only one going through that month, because then you get asked lots of questions. So the day that I actually went before the presbytery, which is the next thing, it says you have your question before the entire presbytery. There were 11 of us that day, and so they asked each of us 1 question on each area. Whereas if you're the only guy up there, they may ask you 10 questions on each area. So you don't want that. You do have to submit a paper as well, which they use to evaluate to see if you understand what you learned in seminary. All right, so that's sort of a basic overview of what has to be done. Then the next thing is, what if you are coming from another area? The qualifications for a pastor transferring in from another presbytery. Not all presbyteries are the same. Some have areas of interest, and they're more scrupulous about certain things. And so what happens there is you go before that credentials committee, that 6 or 7 elders, and they have a time of questioning you. But here they're not questioning you on your general knowledge, but they're questioning you on your views of things. And I don't know if that makes much sense, but for example, general knowledge might be just asking you questions to see if you understand, you know the basics of the Bible, or you know the basics of the Westminster Confession of Faith. But when they're asking you about your views, they're wanting to know, what do you actually think about this or that area? And they will often ask you about some of the more controversial areas that are out there, to see what you think on those areas. So they want to make sure that if you're coming into our presbytery, for example, putting it locally, that you're coming in with a perspective that fits in with the rest of the people in the presbytery. Now that's a little bit over. Before I move on to the next one, which is where it'll start to get a little bit more interesting and controversial. Any questions about things up to this point, or corrections from Mark? Yes, George.
So that panel of elders, they can say, no, that's wrong. We're not going to let you be a pastor at that point.
That is correct. I know a guy that happened to him. He went into his exam period, his written exams, and he didn't do a real good job on his written exams because he didn't study real hard for them. And he put a lot of things in his own words, which is not a problem in itself, as long as using your own wording reflects the truths that are in the Westminster Confession of Faith and our other documents. But they weren't satisfied with his answers. And so when they had the oral exam, they asked him about some of these things, and he didn't do a very good job in his oral exam. So they told him, you need to wait and not be ordained right now. You need to go back and do some more study, and maybe have another year of internship where somebody works more closely with you. So that does happen. Yes.
Can you explain what this may be off the topic a little bit. What is the Cumberland Presbyterian Church? Is supposed to be another traditional branch? Is that any way related to the PCA?
No, it's a separate order. It's a separate denomination, okay. Totally separate. Yeah.
Okay, but are they conservative?
Usually.
Okay.
It's a smaller denomination, and we've known people from several of those around the country, and they're generally pretty conservative. They do have some difference of opinions with us on some of the issues regarding election. Isn't that the issue, Mark, that they have a difference?
It was primarily a frontier version of the Presbyterian Church, and they broke off, 150 years ago, because it was very difficult to send their pastor candidates back east to Princeton, New Jersey, or wherever to go to seminary. And so eventually they just broke off. But it did bring a unique brand of Presbyterianism, because it kind of was cultivated more in the frontier. So you find them around here, of course, in colonial days, we were the frontier. So,
One of my friends grew up in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church here in Birmingham, and he recently joined Briarwood. So if you really want to know from both sides, I can put you in touch with him. All right, any other question about what we've covered so far? Yes, sir. Steve.
Oh, Bobby, you said Briarwood Church doesn't
Yeah.
support the
Cover.
seminary in St. Louis. Can you tell me what seminaries we do support? Or is that,
I know we support BTS Westminster.
or you,
and,
maybe you already said that, I'm
and I
sorry.
believe Reformed, but I'm not 100% sure about that.
And what about Covenant in Chattanooga?
No, that's a Bible college.
Oh, okay,
Or a college. It's not just a Bible college, it's a liberal arts college.
Okay.
And I believe we still support the college. Just not the seminary in St. Louis. Yes, ma'am.
What is ECO? I had to be on a panel for bringing in families at Sanford for the Honors Fellows Program. And someone said had been PCA, but now they're ECO. And when I was
not familiar with
asking
that
about the denomination, and she kind of wanted to change the subject, so.
Well, I know the EPC is the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. That's similar, but I never heard of ECO. Do you know what ECO is, Mark?
I think it's one of the groups, there's several groups that have formed
It's new.
churches out of the more liberal PCUSA.
Okay.
Probably meant we were in the PCUSA and a conservative group left and went into the ECO. It's
Yeah.
and some come into generally most go into the Evangelical Presbyterian Church or the ECO, and there are a couple of other groups that are forming.
Right. One of the interesting things, saying interesting, it's almost sad, is to read Presbyterian church history in America. There have been so many splits and mergers and other splits and other mergers. It's like a maze, like a spider web. It's actually there's no way to keep up with it all because there's so many different groups that have come over the years, and it's an interesting thing to try to diagram it out. As I like to say, the strength of the Presbyterian Church is our commitment to sound doctrine, and the weakness of the Presbyterian Church is our commitment to sound doctrine. Because we can split over the minutest things sometimes, unfortunately. All right, let's move on then. So we talked about the sort of the normal process of a person coming into the church. Talked about a person transferring into the ministry. We talked about a person transferring in. Mark was one of those. He was in the North. It was at North
Tennessee
Georgia.
Valley.
Is that
Tennessee Valley.
Tennessee Valley Presbytery, and then he came here and he got in just by the skin of his no. Mark was no problem, but Mark came in 10, 11 years ago, 15 years ago. How long you did 17 years ago. Okay. So Mark transferred in over here. And so he's been through that. If you want to know more details about it, ask Mark. But there's another issue that's important, and that is this one. What if a pastor changes his views after being ordained? So here's what it says in the Book of Church Order, chapter 21, paragraph 5, number 2. And this is what a pastor needs to agree to. This is part of his ordination vows, which would be said when a person is being ordained here at our church. Do you sincerely receive and adopt the confession of faith and the catechisms of this church as containing the system of doctrine taught in the Holy Scriptures? And do you further promise that if at any time you find yourself out of accord with any of the fundamentals of this system of doctrine, you will on your own initiative make known to the presbytery the change which has taken place in your views since the assumption of this ordination vow? And we reply, yes, I do. And so that is part of the process. But what happens if after you've been ordained and you've been pastoring for a while, you change some of your views and they're no longer in keeping with what our standards teach? Well, this tells you what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to go to the people, the presbytery in your area, and you're supposed to tell them that you've changed your views. And then a discussion would ensue to see whether or not your views are significant enough that you should be put out, or whether you should resign, or whether it's okay. Maybe it's not such a big deal. It depends what the issue is, what your views are. And so that is part of the process of what's supposed to happen. Now, having said that, what often happens is in my experience, is people change their views. This happened when I was with Campus Crusade for Christ as well. They change their views a bit, but they don't really want to leave the group they're part of. So they often don't come forward and acknowledge, I've changed my views. It's unfortunate, but that's what often happens. And so that brings me to what I call the curious case of Greg Johnson. Greg Johnson has been a PCA minister ordained since 2003. And so he would have gone through the same ordination processes that I went through, Mark Cushman went through in terms of answering all the different theological questions. But he was involved with this church, Memorial Presbyterian Church in St. Louis from the late 90s. But then in 2003, he was ordained as an associate pastor there. And I'm not sure what date he became the senior pastor, but it was sometime after that. And so he's been in the PCA for quite some time. But in 2018, his church, Memorial Presbyterian, hosted a conference which was very controversial. It was called Revoice. Some of you may have heard of it. And so it caused quite a bit of consternation in the PCA because of the things that were being promoted at that particular conference regarding homosexuality and transgenderism and other current issues that were being talked about. Subsequent to that, he was interviewed by Christianity Today, and he has publicly declared himself at several times, including in that interview, to be a gay Christian or a homosexual Christian. But he still maintains that he is not out of accord with our doctrines because he says he still believes that the biblical norm is that marriage is between one man and one woman, and because he is personally living a celibate life. And so therefore he considers it okay to continue being a PCA minister in spite of the fact that he identifies himself as a gay Christian or a homosexual Christian. And he has said that he doesn't expect that ever to change. He's written a book about it, in fact. So he doesn't think that he hasn't changed in all these years, and he doesn't expect he ever will change. So that actually created a lot of controversy in our denomination since that happened in 2018. By the way, just to bring you up to date, in November of this past year, 22, just a couple months ago, his church left the PCA, which, as I talked about last time, is very easy for a church to do. And he and the other ministers of the church also resigned from the PCA. So they're just an independent Presbyterian church at the moment. But it brought a lot of controversy. And so the result of that was that a document was put together by Tim Keller, was that?
Kevin DeYoung.
Kevin DeYoung, and about 8 other elders in the PCA put together a document on human sexuality to try to say, what do we as Presbyterian Church in America people believe about human sexuality? Now, Warren has sent you all a copy of that. Came in your email this morning, and you don't have to read the whole thing. You'll be glad to hear that. It's 60 pages long, and there's a lot of minute theological points being made there. But really, if you read the first 11 pages, you've got the gist of it. Because the very beginning of this introductory thing, but then on page 3, it starts with a preamble and why this is being written, what the commission was to give to this group to write about. And so that's worth reading to get the background there. It's about 3 pages long. And then the next 8 pages is basically 12 summary statements. And those summary statements basically is what they concluded. Now, the rest of the paper goes into background on all the detail of each one of those. But though you can read those 12 summary statements, and basically from page 3 to page 13 of that document, and you got the gist of the main things about. In fact, at the General Assembly in 2021, which was in St. Louis, Tim Keller and Kevin DeYoung actually read those 12 statements and made some comments on them. And so that's the essential part. So I would encourage you to read that, because that document was put out by a group of elders. They read it, and then we voted on it as a denomination, and it was almost unanimous. There was 2 or 3 people in the audience that didn't agree with it, but it was basically unanimous. All the commissioners at the General Assembly that year that we accept this as being a good reflection of what our denomination teaches about these things. So if you want to know, that's a good place to start, a good thing to read. So I would encourage you to do that. Well, because of the controversy that came about through what the church, Memorial Presbyterian Church did, and Greg Johnson's outspokenness about his views, what happened was different presbyteries around the country began to try to get some action to change the status quo so that that sort of thing wouldn't be happening. And so they put forward overtures. I think, did we talk about overtures a few weeks ago? Okay, an overture is a proposal or recommendation to the General Assembly to make some kind of a change in our policies. And so at the 2021 General Assembly in St. Louis, which many of us were at, they put forward some overtures to try to get some clarity on some of these issues. So here's one of them, and this is the sort of the last statement. They always give the background in the overture, why they're going to make the proposal they are. And so I'm just giving you the bottom line though. So here's the proposal. And so if you want the whole overture, I have them. But so they're recommending that in chapter 7 of the Book of Church Order, a new paragraph be added. And there's what it was they wanted to add. Men who identify as homosexual, even those who identify as homosexual and claim to practice celibacy in that self-identification, are disqualified from holding office in the PCA. And so that was a proposal that was put forward, an overture it's called. And it was debated quite at length and then voted upon. And it passed the General Assembly, though not by a huge margin, by a slim margin. And then the way it works is anything that's passed by the General Assembly, which is a change to the Book of Church Order. Book of Church Order is our Constitution. It talks about how we function as a church. It's such a big deal to change that then it has to go back to all the presbyteries. And during the course of the following year, every presbytery has to vote on those overtures that were passed at the General Assembly. And if 2/3 of them, 66% of the presbyteries, approve that passed overture, then it goes back the next year to the next General Assembly and gets voted on again by the General Assembly, the commissioners that are there, which is usually about 2,000. Okay. So it's a long process. We don't do things too quickly in the Presbyterian Church. We don't want to make mistakes, so we think things through. So that overture did not pass 2/3 of the presbytery, so it basically just died. Okay. Another one that was also put forward that particular year was overture 23, and that was to amend a different part of the Book of Church Order, chapter 17. And it said that men who had self-identified as a gay Christian, same-sex attracted Christian, homosexual Christian, or like term shall be deemed not qualified for ordination in the PCA. That one, if I'm not mistaken, passed by a much larger majority at the General Assembly, but again, it died in that it did not pass through all of the, did not pass all the presbyteries. So that was for 2021. So then we moved to 2022, which was just this past year. We had General Assembly here in Birmingham. I was actually on the host committee for that. And so one of the overtures that passed at the General Assembly, which is now before all of the presbyteries, is overture 29. And it's kind of long, and that's why I put it up on the screen for you to be able to see it. And it says this: officers in the Presbyterian Church in America, and that would be not just pastors, but elders, deacons, right? Officers in the Presbyterian Church in America must be above reproach in their walk and Christ-like in their character. Anybody disagree with that? Nobody disagrees with that, okay? Those who deny the sinfulness of fallen desires, or who deny the reality and hope of progressive sanctification, or who fail to pursue spirit-empowered victory over their sinful temptations, inclinations, and actions, are not qualified for ordained office. Our standards of conduct is always the Word of God, which transcends any culture. Whether a sin is especially hated or excused in a particular society, shall neither excuse those who are unrepentant nor bar those who are clearly repentant. Well, that's a mouthful, but that passed with a very high percentage at the General Assembly last summer. And it is now before the presbyteries, and 66% of the presbyteries have to pass it this year for it to go back to the General Assembly. At this point, it's passing by a large, what's the percentage?
98.5%.
So far, 98.5% of the presbyteries who voted, not all of them have voted, but the ones who have voted have passed it, 98.5?
Yeah, it has passed because there's not enough. votes.
There's not enough votes, so that one is officially passed, even though our president only votes on it in 2 weeks. Because we postponed it. Usually we vote in November, and through a technicality, they postponed it to February, and so now our vote is, we'll still vote, but because they like to keep records of these things. So that one passed. Now, any questions about that particular overture before we talk about anything else? Because I think that's an important one because that has passed. Yes, ma'am.
So if they don't consider homosexuality a sinful temptation or sin, they can still have someone ordained in their presbytery.
Well, this is where it gets very tricky. Good question there, Jennifer. The thing is this, as I started this section off talking about people who change their views, I think this is the issue is that the wording of this particular overture, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, y'all are both there in some of the discussions. I think they tried to word it in such a way that it does give a little bit of wiggle room. And because what happened prior to the General Assembly, there was not one overture on this subject. There was about 8 last year. Was it 8 or 9? Something like that. All on the same subject. And so then we have at the beginning of the General Assembly, before the Assembly starts meeting in mass, the committee known as the Overtures Committee, which is 2 representatives from every presbytery, come together and they look at the overtures and they take the ones that are similar and they combine them all into one. And so that is quite a job to do. And then that's what we vote on. And so I think part of that process then is a little bit of give and take and compromise. And what they came up with in this one is one where many of us would read what's written here and say, if this is what our standards say, if the Book of Church Order says this, then you should not be a minister in the PCA or any kind of officer if you self-identify as homosexual. Okay. But others would look at it and say, well, that's not the way I see it. And so there's a little bit of wiggle room in there. And that's.
But Bobby, doesn't it, I don't think there's a lot of wiggle room when it says our standard of conduct is always the word of God. And the word of God clearly states the view on homosexuality.
Well, this is where it gets really, let me show you the next one that has not passed, okay? And then I'll come back to that, okay? All right, this one, Overture 15, this past summer said this: men who identify as homosexual, even those who identify as homosexual and claim to practice celibacy in that self-identification, are disqualified from holding office in the PCA. Does that sound familiar? Same one from the year before. They did actually reword it slightly. They took away the word identify and they said those who claim to be or who describe themselves as, that sort of thing. It's all kind of semantic. It's the same point. Okay. This one's very clear, right? This one has not passed the presbyteries. And in order for it to pass, there are 20 presbyteries left to vote, including ours. All 20 of them would have to approve it in order for this one to pass. And that's thanks to Tom, who did all the analysis for me. Thank you very much.
Well, you can follow this.
So this one is probably not going to pass. So that one where it's clear because it uses clear terms. Here, it's a little bit more open to views. That's right. And this is where it gets tricky because some presbyteries are a little more liberal in their views and some are more conservative in their views. That's just the nature of it. Obviously as individuals, we're all different, but it's kind of known that there are certain presbyteries around the country that are they're much more open to the idea of a person like a Greg Johnson who publicly identifies himself as a homosexual Christian being a minister, and it's okay with him. There's others that they just can't stomach that at all. And so there is a real diversity. And so this is where the controversy comes in. So what this particular overture tried to do was not use those hot button words like gay Christian, homosexual Christian, that sort of thing, but still trying to get to the idea. Okay. So part of it is this: those who deny the sinfulness of fallen desires. That's where it gets to your back now, finally getting to your question. There are some people who some Christians in America today, some in our denomination, a lot of them outside our denomination, who would say that if you only have a simple desire, that is your orientation is that you are attracted to the same sex, but you don't act on that, then you've not sinned. Am I expressing that correctly? That's pretty much what they're saying. In other words, they've bought into the cultural belief that we have an orientation sexually. I don't buy that. We're all sinners. We're also all made in the image of God. And so I don't buy the idea that orientation is something that you're born with and it's fixed and it can't be changed. But there are people that say, this is the way I am. Obviously, if this is the way I am, then it's the way God made me. And I have this desire, is towards people of the same sex. And therefore, that's just the way I am. But since I'm not acting on that, it's okay. But it's not okay because we need to be putting to death our sinful desires, the scripture says. And so it's one of those finer points of theology that people argue over. But that's what the issue is right now, is where do you draw the line there? Yes, Ken.
Are there any men, kind of like for women, there's Rosario Butterfield, are there any men that have struggled, however they got lured or trained into this cultural dilemma?
Yep.
And they've made their way out?
Yep.
And so who would those people be?
There's a couple of good ones I would recommend. Christopher Yuan has written a book called Holy Sexuality. Excellent.
He and his mama.
How do you spell the last name?
Yuan,
Yuan.
Taiwanese American.
Okay.
We actually heard him speak just over a year ago at a conference, and he was phenomenal, just phenomenal speaker.
Because the kids,
He was here for as part of the Revoice conference. I mean, not not Revoice. What was that conference the youth had? The Rethink. I knew it was a Rethink conference. Christopher Yuan is excellent. His book is excellent, really well thought out. Another one is Beckett Cook. Beckett Cook has a podcast. He was living a homosexual life in Hollywood, and he's changed his views completely. So a really interesting podcast, which I can send you a link to if any of you want it, is a three-way conversation between Beckett Cook, Rosario Butterfield, and Christopher Yuan, where they discuss these issues and these finer points. And all three of them came out of a homosexual lifestyle and are now walking with the Lord and teaching on these things. And so they have a perspective which I think is worth hearing. And so they talk about those things. Yeah.
One thing to keep in mind, and I've been to probably 35 to 40 General Assemblies, is that when people vote against an overture, it can be done for any number of reasons.
Yeah.
And it would be very, very premature to simply say it's a black and white issue. Those that believe it or disagree. I mean, we have many that don't in the Presbytery that think it's not strict enough.
That's right.
So they vote against it.
Yeah.
Or they think one phrase in it could be rephrased, so they'll vote against it.
Right.
And there are those that would just say, in principle, we don't think a national denominational, the General Assembly needs to be telling the private session what to do, because the session in the PCA is the predominant.
Right.
So it'd be very easy to rush and say, I would say very strongly that your use of the word "the curious case" of Greg Johnson is exactly the terminology. I've talked to psychiatrists who say people like him don't exist, that live their whole life without practicing and yet still take on the identification. He says that's very rare. And I think the chance of the PCA, and I can't speak for every Presbytery, getting close to ordaining and practicing homosexual is almost nil. I mean, and in our culture, we are still considered a very reactionary, conservative, bigoted homophobic denomination. And from a biblical perspective, that's not a bad title. It's, I think the struggle is that many teaching elders and ruling elders want to be very open and loving and ministering to people with all kinds of needs, sexual needs, as well as all kinds of sinful needs. And in our day and age, that breeds a lot of debate about how to do it. It did it in Jesus' day. I mean, he had the audacity to walk into the houses of tax collectors and would roundly judge because of that. And there's a little of that going on. There's a difference in philosophy of how we best minister. And some think, well, just an overture in black and white like this is so cut and dry. I just don't think we ought to do it this way.
Right.
They agree with the content, but I think that's a good thing to keep in mind.
And we need to close because of time, but that's outstanding. Thank you for saying all of that. Really good. And let me just say one thing that I have found interesting is that I've heard some ministers who say the things that Mark was just talking about as to why they would vote against that, say that if we have something like this in black and white, it's going to hinder us from being able to minister to people who are struggling in this area and they won't come to our churches. I'd like to say, I don't think that's true, because we have at least 3 that I know of in this church. 2 of them are staff members who were former homosexuals who are now on our staff, and others I know who are struggling in this area and who are fighting it and meeting regularly with ministers of the church to try to get over this problem in their life. So it hasn't kept, Briarwood's conservative stance has not kept those people from coming and being part of our fellowship. So I think that's an argument that I don't think holds water, because we see just the opposite. But yes, thank you, Mark. I have heard many people say, oh, well, the wording of this or the wording of that's not good. And they're on the conservative side and they vote against a thing that looks conservative because they think it's poorly worded. And it's been interesting to hear so many of the conservatives say this doesn't go far enough, so I'm going to vote against it until we get something stronger. And so the fact that these things don't pass, you can't just make a blanket assessment of what that means. Well, as I said, I probably raised more questions than I answered, but let's close in prayer. Lord, thank you for this time of discussion, and I pray that you would guide us, help us as a body here at Briarwood, especially, to be clear on what we do believe and be gracious in the way we communicate what we believe, and that you would continue to give us the opportunity to minister to people who struggle with these areas of same-sex attraction. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.